I never thought I'd be the type to fall for a whirlwind romance. I always prided myself on being rational, measured, cautious. But then came Daniel, a man who seemed to have stepped right out of a dream, speaking to the quiet loneliness I never dared to admit. He wasn't just charming, he was magnetic. The kind of man who knew how to make a woman feel like she was the only one in the world. From the very first moment we met, he made me feel understood in a way no one else ever had. He had this effortless way of turning the ordinary into something extraordinary. A casual touch on the small of my back, a whispered joke meant just for me, a look that lingered long enough to make my pulse quicken. His attention was intoxicating, his devotion absolute. He was always there, calling, texting, planning dates that felt like something out of a romance novel. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I felt loved. Or at least, I thought I was. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs, the way his expression would change, just a flicker, barely noticeable, whenever I mentioned my investments. The offhand comments about how love should be free of financial barriers, how couples should share everything. The subtle yet persistent nudges. Why wait when we both knew we were meant to be together? But I was caught in the haze of affection, and I ignored that tiny voice inside me whispering that this was all happening too fast. So, when Daniel proposed, I said yes. Not because I was certain, but because I wanted to be. I wanted to believe in the love he described so vividly, in the future he painted with such passion. I convinced myself that my doubts were just fear in disguise, that real love required trust. So I gave him mine, completely, irrevocably. The wedding was beautiful, or at least, that's what everyone told me. A flawless ceremony, a reception filled with laughter, a night that should have been the happiest of my life. And maybe, for a few fleeting hours it was. But even as I smiled for the cameras and held Daniel's hand, something felt off. A strange, quiet unease curled in my chest, but I pushed it down. I told myself it was just nerves, just the overwhelming rush of change. Daniel, of course, was perfect. He always knew the right thing to say, the right way to touch me to make the doubts melt away. "This is our beginning," he whispered against my ear that night, his voice full of promise. "Just you and me." His words wrapped around me like a spell, and I let myself believe them. In the weeks that followed, I settled into married life, trying to ignore the tiny moments that didn't quite make sense. The way Daniel took sudden interest in our finances, the casual yet insistent questions about my accounts, my assets. "It's just practical," he'd say, smiling, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "We're married now, sweetheart. We should plan for the future together." I wanted to believe he was right, that this was normal, that this was what love looked like. So, when he suggested combining some of our finances, I hesitated, just for a moment, before agreeing. After all, I had nothing to hide, and Daniel, well, he was my husband now, my partner. Trust was supposed to be the foundation of marriage, wasn't it? At first, nothing really changed. If anything, Daniel seemed even more affectionate, as if securing our future together had deepened his love for me. He'd hold my hand in public, kiss my forehead absent-mindedly while I worked, tell me how lucky he was to have found me. It was intoxicating. But then, little by little, the warmth began to cool. The texts became less frequent. The good morning kisses started feeling obligatory rather than instinctive. He was still present, still attentive when he wanted to be, but there was a shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. Some nights, I'd wake up to find him missing from our bed, only to hear his muffled voice coming from another room, talking in hushed tones. "Late-night work calls," he said. "Nothing to worry about." And yet, the unease I felt on our wedding day never really left. If anything, it grew stronger, whispering that something wasn't right. That something about Daniel, about us, wasn't as perfect as I had let myself believe. But I silenced those thoughts the way I always did, convincing myself that love required trust, that doubt was just a bad habit I needed to break. So I ignored it. The strange phone calls, the odd tension in his voice when money came up, the way he deflected whenever I asked about his own assets. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was imagining problems where none existed. After all, Daniel loved me. He had chosen me. I had no reason to doubt him. Right? It didn't happen all at once. If it had, maybe I would have seen it coming. Maybe I would have braced myself for impact. But deception, real deception, isn't loud. It's quiet, creeping in through the smallest cracks, settling in places you don't think to look. And by the time you notice it, it's already everywhere. Daniel changed. Slowly at first. His affection became sporadic, like a faucet he controlled, turning it on when he wanted something, shutting it off when he didn't. The sweet messages, the lingering touches, the playful teasing, all of it faded into something colder, something calculated. Some days he was the man I married. Other days he barely looked at me. Then came the control. Small things, things that seemed harmless on their own. He started handling more of our finances, convincing me it was easier that way. "You don't have to stress about it," he said, slipping an arm around my shoulders. "Let me take care of it." When I hesitated, he laughed, kissed my forehead. "You trust me, don't you?" I told myself I did. I told myself that's what marriage was. Partnership, compromise, letting go. But then I started noticing the things I wasn't meant to see. The bills I hadn't authorized, the transfers I didn't remember making. My name disappearing from accounts that had always been mine. And when I questioned it, Daniel had an answer for everything. A smile, a soothing word, a perfectly reasonable excuse. But I wasn't imagining things. Something was wrong. And deep down, I already knew. I just wasn't ready to face it. The breaking point came in the most unremarkable way. A misplaced email, a notification I wasn't supposed to see. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, when my phone lit up, a bank alert about a withdrawal I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a glitch. But as I scrolled through the transactions, a cold realization settled over me. Money was missing, not just a little, thousands, moved in small amounts, just under the threshold that would have triggered my bank's fraud alerts. I felt my stomach twist as I clicked through the statements. Some transfers were to accounts I didn't recognize, others, Daniel's. I stared at the screen, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. My hands were shaking. No, this had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe he had moved things around for a reason. Maybe there was an explanation. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I just hadn't been ready to see it. That night, I watched him closer than ever. The way he walked through our house like he belonged to it more than I did. The way he scrolled through his phone, smiling at messages he never shared with me. The way his fingers tightened around his glass of whiskey when I asked about our accounts. His voice just a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed. "Why are you asking all these questions, sweetheart?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're not doubting me, are you?" It was meant to be disarming, the way he looked at me, the way he said it. But it only made me more certain. This wasn't love. This was something else entirely. Doubt is a funny thing. It starts as a whisper, a fleeting thought you push aside. But once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And now, it was everywhere. I started looking for answers, and it didn't take long to find them. A late-night search through his desk drawer revealed documents I had never signed. Financial forms, account changes, transfers made in my name but without my knowledge. My name was there, but the signatures? They weren't mine. And then there was the phone, his spare, hidden at the back of his nightstand. A second device he never mentioned, never used in front of me. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. No passcode. Almost as if he thought I'd never find it. Messages. Hundreds of them. Some about money, cold and transactional, detailing transfers, deadlines, accounts being drained piece by piece. And others far worse. A woman's name repeated over and over, their conversations sickeningly intimate, their plans detailed and clear. He hadn't just been taking my money, he'd been planning his exit. And then, as if the universe had a cruel sense of humor, a message popped up at that exact moment. "Almost done with her. Just a little longer." The room seemed to tilt around me. My body felt frozen, my mind racing ahead of me. There it was. Proof. Unshakable, undeniable proof of what I had been too blind to see. I should have confronted him. I should have screamed, thrown the phone in his face, demanded answers. But instead, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't going to break down. I wasn't going to let him win. No, I was going to make him pay. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even let myself feel the full weight of what I had just uncovered. Instead, I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling something colder, sharper, settle inside me. Pain was useless. Anger was temporary. But revenge? Revenge could be permanent. I had spent my whole life playing by the rules, believing in fairness, in honesty. And look where it had gotten me. Used, betrayed, manipulated by a man who had never loved me. No, Daniel didn't deserve my heartbreak. He didn't even deserve my rage. He deserved to lose. Completely. So I wiped my tears, took a breath, and started planning. First, I needed control. Over my accounts, my assets, my name. I spent the next few days moving money, redirecting investments, locking down everything that had once been accessible to both of us. Quietly, methodically. I changed passwords, revoked his access, closed joint accounts. If he noticed, he didn't say anything, not yet. He was still confident, still convinced that I was clueless. That was his first mistake. The next step was patience. I couldn't rush this. I needed him to believe everything was still under his control. So I smiled. I played my part. I let him kiss me, let him whisper sweet nothings that meant nothing at all. I pretended not to notice when he stayed out later, when his phone lit up with messages he thought I couldn't see. I let him think I was still blind, still naive. But behind that facade, I was dismantling everything he had built. I met with my lawyer under the guise of a casual lunch, ensuring that legally, every asset was under my name alone. I combed through every transaction, every account he had touched, collecting evidence. If he wanted to take everything from me, I would make sure he was the one left with nothing. And then, I set the final stage. The bait. Over dinner one night, I brought up money, feigning concern. I was thinking, I said, swirling my wine glass. Maybe we should move some of my investments to a joint account, just to make things easier. His eyes lit up, just for a second. Barely noticeable, but I caught it. Hook, line, sinker. Daniel took the bait, just as I knew he would. He acted casual, pretending to hesitate, as if he wasn't already planning how to bleed me dry. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" he asked, reaching for my hand across the table. His touch was warm, but now I knew the truth. There was nothing behind it but greed. "I mean, I don't want you to feel pressured. It's your money." I almost laughed. The performance was so seamless, so effortless, like he'd played this role 100 times before. But I had rehearsed too. I squeezed his hand, giving him the soft, trusting smile of a woman still in love. "Of course," I murmured. "What's mine is yours, right?" That was all he needed. Within days, he started moving more aggressively. I watched from the shadows as he dug his own grave. He made calls, set up meetings, even hinted at needing my signature on a few routine financial forms. I played along, signing the ones I had carefully altered with my lawyer's help. Documents that stripped him of any real claim to my assets while giving me full control over his. Every move he made, I was 3 steps ahead. I let him believe he was winning. Let him dream of the fortune he thought he was about to steal. And then, I led him exactly where I wanted him to go. The moment arrived sooner than I expected. Daniel thought he was in control, but he was already standing on a trap door, and I was the one holding the lever. He had convinced himself that he was the mastermind, that I was nothing more than a clueless wife, blinded by love. So when he finally brought up divorce, I almost admired his confidence. Almost. We were sitting in the living room, him nursing a whiskey, me pretending not to notice the tension in his jaw. "I've been thinking," he started, swirling the glass in his hand. Maybe we rushed into this. A dramatic sigh, a perfectly timed glance away. I love you, Anna, but I think we want different things. I almost laughed. The sheer audacity of it. He had drained my accounts, cheated on me, planned his escape, and now he wanted me to believe he was struggling with this decision. I nodded, biting my lip, letting my eyes water just enough to be convincing. I don't understand, I whispered. I thought we were happy. He exhaled, reaching for my hand, playing the part of the reluctant husband. It's for the best, he said gently. We'll figure out the finances later. And that was it. The final move. The moment he thought he had won. But I wasn't heartbroken. I wasn't scared, because I had already taken everything from him. Daniel expected tears. He expected devastation. What he didn't expect was silence. I watched as he shifted in his seat, waiting for my breakdown, for me to beg him to stay. Instead, I just nodded. Okay, I said softly, letting the word hang between us. His brow furrowed, his fingers tightening around his glass. Just, okay? I exhaled, looking down at my hands like I was processing the shock. If this is what you want, I murmured, swallowing hard, we'll work through it. His relief was almost palpable. He had no idea that while he sat there, convinced he had the upper hand, I had already stripped him of everything. The next morning, I let him serve me divorce papers, watching as he placed them on the kitchen table with the certainty of a man who believed he had just secured his future. I'll be fair, he said, masking his greed behind faux generosity. We'll split everything evenly. I smiled. Of course, I said, signing the papers without hesitation. He didn't know that my signature was the final nail in his coffin, that the moment he filed them, every safeguard I had put in place would activate. By the time he realized what I had done, it would be too late. Daniel's victory was short-lived. It started with a call from his lawyer, one I had been expecting. I watched from across the kitchen as he answered, his confident smirk slipping the moment he heard the words on the other end. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I didn't need to. I already knew. His accounts, empty. His claim to my assets, non-existent. The money he thought he had been siphoning, moved, protected, untouchable. And the best part? Every shady financial move he had made, every unauthorized transaction, every forged document, was now linked directly to him. His face drained of color as reality set in. That's not possible, he snapped into the phone, pacing the room. There has to be a mistake. But there wasn't. The mistake had been his, underestimating me. He hung up, his hands shaking, his eyes finally meeting mine. For the first time since this entire game had started, I saw it, the fear. Anna, he started, his voice different now. No more arrogance, no more control. What did you do? I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Then finally, I spoke. What's mine is mine, Daniel. I smiled. And what's yours was never really yours to begin with. I stood, leaving him sitting there, his world crumbling around him. I didn't need to say anything else. The damage was already done. Daniel didn't leave right away. At first, he refused to believe it, convinced that there was some loophole, some way out. He made calls, paced the house, muttering to himself. But there was no escape. Every account he thought he had access to was gone. Every asset he had counted on was untouchable. And the cherry on top? The legal trouble waiting for him once the authorities started reviewing those unauthorized transactions. I watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. I had envisioned this moment 100 times, imagined how it would feel to see him broken, desperate. But now that it was here, I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't laughing. I was just done. The house was mine. The life we had built together, every piece of it, belonged to me. And him? He was nothing more than a ghost now, an afterthought, a man who had tried to ruin me but had only destroyed himself. And yet, as I stood in the doorway, watching him pack the last of his things, I felt something unexpected. Not regret, not guilt, relief. Daniel lingered for a moment, his hands gripping the suitcase handle like it was the only solid thing left in his world. He wanted to say something. I could see it in the way his jaw tensed, in the way his eyes darted toward mine, searching for the woman he had once manipulated so easily. But she wasn't here anymore. I stood by the staircase, arms crossed, silent. I didn't owe him anything. No explanations, no final words. I had already won. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if convincing himself this wasn't real. "You're going to regret this," he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with bitterness. I almost laughed. Regret? No. The only regret I had was ever believing in him. But I didn't say that. I just met his gaze, calm and unwavering. "You should go," I said simply. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel had nothing left to say. No clever remarks, no manipulative charm, no empty promises. Just silence. And that silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. The door closed behind him, and with it, the last remnants of the lie I had been living. The moment he was gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The house felt different now, lighter, quieter. The air itself seemed to shift, as if it had been waiting for him to leave to finally breathe again. I walked through each room slowly, reclaiming my space. The couch where we had once sat, him whispering empty promises in my ear. The kitchen table where he had placed those divorce papers, so sure of his victory. The bedroom, where I had once laid awake at night, wondering why the love I thought I had wasn't enough. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I had survived him, outsmarted him. And now I was free. Standing by the window, I watched as Daniel disappeared down the driveway, his posture tense, his world shattered. Maybe he would start over somewhere else, find another woman to manipulate, another life to steal. Or maybe, just maybe, this was the end of his game. Either way, I didn't care, because for the first time in a long time, my life was mine again. And that was all that mattered.